May 1978, the Cannes Film Festival is engulfed in absolute chaos. Inside the Palais des Festivals, a frantic security team battles a surging, screaming crowd. In the center of this storm stands a 12-year-old girl in a white dress, terrified as a stranger desperately tries to shear off a lock of her hair. Her name is Brooke Shields. Behind her lies Pretty Baby, a film that has just shocked the global elite and ignited a legal and moral wildfire. For the world, she was the ultimate cinematic sensation. But for Brooke, this glamorous nightmare was the beginning of an era of unprecedented public scrutiny, where her innocence was traded for stardom, and her true voice was buried under a decades-long forbidden secret. In May 1978, the French Riviera became the stage for one of the most explosive scandals in modern cinematic history. The 31st Cannes Film Festival had seen its fair share of boundary-pushing cinema, but nothing prepared the international press, film critics, or the public for the premiere of Louis Malle's Pretty Baby. Centered on the story of Violet, a 12-year-old child growing up inside a Storyville brothel in 1917 New Orleans, the film thrust its real-life 12-year-old star into a raging global culture war overnight. I was just a child doing a job, but the world looked at me and decided I was something else entirely. The reaction at Cannes was split down a razor-thin line, exposing a deep divide between artistic praise and moral outrage. On one side, the festival's elite jury celebrated the movie's lush visual aesthetic, awarding it the technical grand prize. Highbrow film critics marveled at the haunting photography and delicate direction, attempting to frame the work as an uncompromising exploration of lost innocence and historical realism. On the other side of the velvet rope, a wave of public fury erupted. Censorship boards across multiple countries immediately threatened bans, while conservative groups and child advocates condemned the project as an unethical exploitation of a minor. The media seized on the controversy, turning the festival into a media circus where art took a backseat to intense moral panics. At the center of this storm stood Brooke Shields. She was not a seasoned adult actor trained to handle international hostility. She was a sixth grader who still traveled with her stuffed animals. The physical reality of the Cannes red carpet was terrifying for the young actress. Photographers jostled violently for position, blinding her with flashbulbs, while aggressive crowds pushed past security barriers just to get a look at the child who had scandalized the industry. The chaos reached a disturbing climax during one of the festival appearances. As the crowd surged forward around her, a fanatical onlooker managed to reach past the security guards, producing a pair of scissors and attempting to cut off a lock of Brooke's hair right on the red carpet. The shock of the moment brought the immediate danger into sharp focus. She was no longer just an actress promoting a project. She had been transformed into an object of intense public fascination, obsession, and judgment. Instead of experiencing the glamorous debut typical of a rising star, Brooke spent those days learning a hard lesson in survival. Journalists swarmed her during interviews, firing loaded, uncomfortable questions designed to trap a child into discussing adult sexuality, morality, and her own innocence. Behind the scenes, those close to the production watched in awe as the young girl adapted to the pressure. Rather than breaking down, Brooke quickly developed a protective psychological barrier. She learned to disassociate the public persona being dissected in the newspapers from the actual child sitting in the hotel room. She smiled politely, kept her answers simple and detached, and retreated into a calm inner world to shield her spirit from the surrounding madness. The media and the public had taken a 12-year-old girl and elevated her into a global flashpoint, turning her face into a symbol of a fierce debate over art, morality, and childhood. For Brooke, Cannes was not a celebration of cinematic achievement. It was the moment she realized that the world outside would always try to project its own dark fantasies and judgments onto her. Yet to understand how an 11-year-old child ended up at the absolute epicenter of one of the most controversial film projects in Hollywood history, the story must trace back even further, all the way to her earliest infancy under the steering hand of an intensely ambitious mother who saw her daughter's beauty as the ultimate ticket to legacy and success. I wanted her to be the most beautiful woman in the world, and I made sure the world saw her before she could even talk. Long before Brooke Shields was surrounded by screaming crowds in France, her path was mapped out in a small apartment in New York. Born in May 1965, Brooke inherited two wildly different legacies. Her father, Frank Shields, came from a wealthy family with roots in Italian nobility and worked as an executive for the cosmetics brand Revlon. Her mother, Terry Schmuck, was a former model and small-time actress who came from a working-class background and struggled to make a lasting mark in show business. The marriage between Frank and Terry was brief and volatile, ending in divorce when Brooke was only 5 months old. Frank's family paid Terry a financial settlement, partly in hopes that she would quietly step away and raise the child far from the public eye. But Terry had a very different vision. She gained sole custody of her daughter, determined to raise a child who would achieve the fame and fortune that had slipped through her own fingers. The commercialization of Brooke Shields began almost before she could sit upright. When Brooke was just 11 months old, Terry arranged for her to audition for a print campaign. The baby landed her first major gig posing for Ivory Snow soapboxes. From that moment on, Brooke was not just a child. She was a brand in the making. Throughout her toddler years, her days were filled with go-sees, lighting adjustments, and long hours under hot studio lamps. She modeled for department store catalogs, appeared in print advertisements for luxury fashion lines, and starred in television commercials before she even entered kindergarten. At the center of this rapid childhood career was the intense, intricate dynamic between Brooke and her mother. Terry operated simultaneously as Brooke's fiercest protector and her most demanding business manager. On one hand, Terry shielded her daughter from predatory industry figures, guarded her schedule closely, and made sure Brooke never missed a meal or a nap on set. On the other hand, Terry completely orchestrated Brooke's life around the camera lens. The line between motherly love and commercial management dissolved entirely. Terry made all the financial decisions, curated Brooke's public image, and treated her daughter's physical beauty as an enterprise they ran together. For Brooke, this arrangement felt natural because she had never known anything else. She grew up believing that pleasing her mother meant standing still for the camera, smiling on command, and remaining quiet between takes. While other kids her age were playing in public parks, Brooke was learning how to hold a pose for hours and memorize cue lines. She adored her mother and depended on her completely for emotional validation, which gave Terry total control over the young girl's trajectory. By the mid-1970s, as Brooke approached her 10th birthday, her portfolio as a child model was unmatched. Her face was recognized across America on magazine covers, billboards, and retail boxes. Yet despite all the commercial success, Terry recognized a growing problem. The print modeling market had its limits, and a growing child could quickly outgrow the cute commercial phase. Brooke's face was becoming familiar, but familiarity without a major artistic vehicle risked fading into the background. Terry knew that to secure true power, longevity, and elite status in the entertainment world, her daughter needed to transition from catalog pages to the big screen. That opportunity arrived when news began circulating that an acclaimed French film director was arriving in New York searching for a unique young face to lead his next major American production. She didn't understand the adult world she was playing in, but she knew exactly how to make the camera fall in love with her. In the spring of 1977, production for Pretty Baby moved to the historic humid streets of New Orleans, transforming the French Quarter into a cinematic replica of the 1917 Storyville red light district. Paramount Pictures had backed the project with a budget of roughly $3 million, a substantial sum for a period drama at the time. At the helm was Louis Malle, an acclaimed French director known for pushing thematic boundaries alongside screenwriter and production designer Polly Platt. Malle envisioned a visually striking historical piece that explored the atmospheric realities of early 20th century brothels without preaching moral judgments. To him, 11-year-old Brooke Shields possessed a rare, striking innocence that contrasted perfectly with the gritty background of the story. Behind the scenes, however, the filming process highlighted the glaring lack of psychological safeguards for child actors during that era. Today, sets involving minors operate under strict protocols including child psychologists, intimacy coordinators, and regulated hours. In 1977, those concepts were virtually non-existent. The responsibility of protecting young actors fell almost entirely on parents or guardians, and in Brooke's case, that meant her mother, Terry. Terry's presence on set quickly became a focal point for the cast and crew. She was fiercely protective in many administrative matters, demanding high compensation and precise billing for her daughter. Yet her daily behavior during production painted a complicated picture. While Brooke spent long hours on set working under the intense studio lights, Terry frequently spent time away from the immediate filming areas, socializing and drinking in nearby New Orleans bars. Members of the production crew often found themselves keeping an eye on the young girl between takes, stepping in to offer casual adult supervision while her mother was absent. To navigate the complex and sensitive material, the filmmakers relied heavily on framing the story as a simple game of make-believe. When it came to delicate or challenging scenes, director Louis Malle and crew members repeatedly assured Brooke that she was merely playing a game. They broke down every motion step by step, explaining that her character was simply an ordinary child living in an unusual house, dressing up in costumes and pretending. Brooke, eager to perform well and keep her mother proud, approached every scene with total professionalism, entirely unaware of how the adult world would eventually interpret those images on screen. Malle approached the film from a purely artistic standpoint, focusing on historical realism, lighting, and period details. He saw himself creating a serious work of art about a forgotten chapter of American history. But this artistic vision failed to account for the real-world impact on a young girl caught in the center of an adult narrative. The contrast between Malle's lofty artistic ambitions and the complete lack of psychological protection for his child, Starr created a fragile situation. By the time principal photography wrapped, the cast and crew had successfully finished the $3 million production, believing they had crafted a powerful piece of cinema. But as the raw footage was assembled and sent out to film distributors and censorship boards across the globe, the art house narrative was immediately stripped away, triggering a massive wave of legal threats, bans, and public outrage that would soon shake the industry. We condemned the movie in our editorials, then put the child on our front cover to sell the morning paper. When Pretty Baby hit theaters in the spring of 1978, the film industry held its breath. Paramount Pictures had backed a project that pushed the outer limits of acceptable cinema, and the commercial gamble produced an immediate chaotic aftermath. Financially, the movie managed to pull in $5.8 million in theatrical rentals across the United States and Canada. While those figures allowed the film to recoup its initial $3 million production cost, the true story of its release was written not in box office receipts but in courtroom dockets and censorship board meetings. The international backlash was swift and uncompromising. In South Africa, government censors slapped the film with a complete total ban, refusing to allow a single frame to be screened in public theaters. Across the United States, local prosecutors and conservative legal coalitions launched a series of high-profile lawsuits aiming to block local screenings. State legislatures found themselves dragged into intense debates over child protection statutes, struggling to define where artistic expression ended and the exploitation of a minor began. Judges were forced to evaluate whether a film set in a historical brothel constituted a legitimate work of art or a violation of criminal law. Yet beneath this fierce public outrage lay a profound hypocritical paradox. The very society that loudly condemned the film's premise was simultaneously consumed by an insatiable appetite for the child at its center. News outlets ran scathing opinion pieces denouncing the movie on page 3 while printing full-color photographs of 12-year-old Brooke Shields on page 1 to boost newsstand sales. Newsweek and major fashion magazines rushed to feature her face on their covers. The public lined up outside newsagents to buy every magazine carrying her image, creating a bizarre commercial reality where the outrage itself drove the girl's celebrity to unprecedented heights. This hypocrisy exposed a fundamental flaw in the entertainment machine of the late 1970s. Hollywood executives and media moguls publicly distanced themselves from the film's controversial themes, yet they eagerly harvested the massive profits generated by Brooke's sudden cultural ubiquity. The industry had successfully transformed a 12-year-old girl into a hyper-profitable brand, monetizing both the moral panic surrounding her and her natural beauty in equal measure. Rather than retreating in the face of legal threats and public controversy, the corporate marketers watching these figures reached a calculated decision. They saw that controversy was the most effective promotional tool in existence. Instead of stepping back to protect a young girl, brand promoters and film studios prepared to push the boundaries even further, setting the stage to turn Brooke Shields into the most sought-after, talked-about teenager on the planet. Do you want to know what comes between me and my Calvin's nothing? By 1980, 15-year-old Brooke Shields had been elevated from a controversial child actress into an unrivaled global phenomenon. The summer release of The Blue Lagoon pushed her box office appeal into the stratosphere, generating over $58 million domestically and turning the tropical survival romance into a massive commercial hit. But it was a fashion campaign later that same year that truly shook pop culture. Hired as the face of Calvin Klein jeans, Brooke delivered a line that became instantly iconic and deeply provocative. The television commercials triggered immediate bans on major network affiliates, but the resulting shockwave drove sales to historic highs, with the designer brand selling millions of pairs of denim each month. As her commercial footprint expanded, the media's obsession with her private life reached a fever pitch. In late 1980, veteran journalist Barbara Walters sat down with the teenager for a primetime national broadcast. Rather than focusing on her work or schoolwork, the interview quickly turned into a tense, invasive interrogation. Walters pressed the 15-year-old girl with sharp, relentless questions about her physical appearance, her dating history, and her personal boundaries. The veteran interviewer went so far as to ask Brooke if she had any secrets from her mother and probed deeply into her physical innocence. Throughout the relentless line of questioning, Brooke remained composed, answering with polite, rehearsed brevity, while the nation watched an adult journalist attempt to pry open the personal life of a minor on primetime television. The dark side of this intense global exposure soon manifested as direct threats to her physical safety. Fan letters turned into disturbing obsessive fixations. Dangerous stalkers began showing up at her hotel lobbies, her school, and outside her home. Security guards became a permanent feature of her daily routine, routinely screening mail, sweeping public venues before her arrival, and escorting her through back exits to avoid individuals who believed they owned a piece of her life. To survive the immense pressure, Brooke was forced to live a dual existence, paying a heavy emotional price. To the global public, she was an untouchable, hyper-glamorized commercial icon whose image decorated billboards across Times Square. But behind closed doors, away from the cameras and lighting rigs, she remained a deeply devout, quiet teenage girl who went to mass, stayed home on weekends, and relied heavily on her faith and family for stability. She learned to completely dissociate her real self from the public brand bearing her name, retreating into internal silence whenever the noise around her grew too deafening. For decades, Brooke kept her head down, enduring the invasive media scrutiny and the heavy expectations imposed on her by the industry. She carried the weight of her public image quietly, letting others dictate her narrative. However, as the years passed, major life transitions and the eventual death of her mother would force her to step out from behind that protective silence, inspiring her to finally reclaim the rights to her own story. For my whole life, other people wrote the narrative. Now I am taking the pen back. The silence that Brooke Shields maintained throughout her youth could not last forever. As she transitioned into adulthood, attended Princeton University, and built an independent career on her own terms, the drive to process her extraordinary past became impossible to ignore. The turning point came in late 2012 with the passing of her mother, Terry Shields. Terry's death marked the end of a complex, lifelong partnership, one built on deep love, fierce ambition, and absolute control. Free from the fear of hurting her mother's feelings, Brooke finally took her first major step toward reclaiming her narrative. In 2014, Brooke published her candid memoir, There Was a Little Girl, The Real Story of My Mother and Me. In its pages, she laid bare the intricate reality of growing up under Terry's wing. Rather than offering a bitter tell-all, Brooke presented a nuanced portrait of a mother who was simultaneously her greatest protector and the architect of her childhood exploitation. She confronted the painful paradox of loving a parent whose desperate alcoholism and commercial drive had exposed her to global scrutiny before she even knew who she was. The definitive reclaiming of her voice arrived nearly a decade later at the 2023 Sundance Film Festival with the premiere of the two-part documentary series Pretty Baby Brooke Shields. Now a woman in her late 50s, Brooke stood before the camera not as a passive subject but as the active narrator of her life. The documentary systematically dismantled the media myths that had surrounded her since the late 1970s. She explicitly called out the hypocrisy of an entertainment system that had sexualized a minor while washing its hands of moral responsibility. In one particularly sharp sequence, she directly addressed those past invasive interviews, pointing out how comfortable adult reporters had felt cornering a teenager on national television with questions no child should ever be asked. A central motivation for this public reckoning was the fierce desire to protect her own family. Raising two daughters in the digital age, Brooke took every possible measure to ensure they grew up far from the hyper-commercialized pressure chamber she had endured. She drew a firm boundary around their childhoods, prioritizing their mental health education and autonomy above any industry opportunities. Watching her daughters grow made the choices of her own youth even clearer, hardening her resolve to speak out against the systemic exploitation of young people in show business. Through her memoir, her documentary work, and her ongoing advocacy, Brooke Shields completed a dramatic transformation. She refused to remain framed forever as a passive victim of 1970s media culture or an aging icon defined solely by her teenage years. By stepping into the light as a producer, writer, and speaker, she redefined what relevance and longevity mean for women in Hollywood. She proved that while a child can be thrust into the center of a world-shaking controversy without her consent, an adult woman holds the absolute power to rewrite the final chapter of her story.